In the late 1960s and early 1970s, a small group of researchers began bringing an unusual subject into the laboratory. Electrodes were placed on scalps. Oxygen consumption was measured. Breathing slowed. Heart rates shifted. And the quiet interior of meditation, long treated as a spiritual or philosophical matter, was suddenly being described in the language of physiology. If you imagine yourself standing in one of those early rooms, with paper charts moving and instruments humming softly, the scene feels almost improbable. A practice associated with monasteries, retreat halls, and inner stillness had entered the world of modern measurement. What those scientists were really confronting was not only a technique, but a deeper problem. How do you study an experience that happens from the inside? How do you translate attention, awareness, silence, and the wandering of thought into something a machine can record and a journal can publish? The puzzle was larger than meditation itself. It touched one of the oldest tensions in the history of ideas, the gap between what a person feels directly and what science can observe from the outside. Meditation seemed to sit exactly at that boundary, where private experience and public evidence meet, and often fail to fit neatly together. Then the story grew stranger. By the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, meditation was no longer only a curiosity for physiologists. It moved into hospitals, psychology clinics, and neuroscience labs. Brain scans seemed to suggest that training the mind might alter the brain itself. Headlines grew bold. Claims spread quickly. The old image of meditation as a quiet spiritual exercise gave way to a new and more modern promise: that sitting still could reshape attention, emotion, pain, and perhaps even the physical structure of the mind's machinery. But how much of that promise was true? And how much was the product of hope, culture, and the seductive power of brain images? When scientists tried to uncover what meditation was really doing, were they discovering a profound biological reality, or struggling to measure something far more subtle than they first believed? And if meditation does change the brain, what exactly is changing? At first, almost nothing seems to happen. A person sits down, perhaps in the dim quiet of early morning, perhaps at the end of a long day when the world has finally stopped asking for anything. The body settles only gradually. Sounds from the room remain where they were. A distant engine passes. A floorboard answers its own age. Breath moves in and out with no sign of revelation. And yet, the moment attention turns inward, the stillness begins to change character. Thoughts arrive before they are invited. Memories come with the peculiar sharpness of things that were not supposed to matter. A plan for tomorrow appears. Then an old embarrassment. Then a sentence with no speaker attached to it at all. The mind, which from the outside can look so composed, reveals itself as active, unstable, and strangely difficult to remain beside. The deeper surprise is not that the mind wanders, but that the wandering becomes visible only when one tries to be still. Ordinarily, thought flows by wearing the costume of necessity. It feels like life itself. But in the first minutes of contemplative practice, the usual seamlessness breaks apart. Attention reaches for the breath, loses it, returns, slips again. A sensation in the knee becomes a story. A sound becomes a judgment. A simple instruction, remain here, turns out to be far from simple. What begins as quiet can quickly become a kind of encounter with movement that had been there all along, hidden by habit. Long before any scientist placed an electrode on a scalp or asked a volunteer to lie inside a scanner, This was already the mystery waiting at the center of meditation. How could a human being be so close to the workings of his own mind and know so little about how it moved? In many contemplative traditions, that instability was not treated as failure, but as the beginning of inquiry. What modern psychology would later call mindfulness is most firmly rooted in Buddhist psychology, though scholars also note resonances with other philosophical and contemplative traditions. The crucial point is that attention itself became an object of disciplined practice. Sensation, impulse, feeling, distraction. Even the illusion of a solid and continuous self could be watched, not merely endured. In South Asian and later East Asian traditions, the inner life was not approached as a vague spiritual atmosphere, but as a field of training, one that required posture, repetition, ethical framing, and often years of patient correction. Seen from that angle, meditation was never simply relaxation. It was a method for observing the conditions under which experience is constructed, sustained, and misunderstood. That older inheritance would matter enormously once modern science finally turned toward it, because the scientists were not encountering a blank mystery. They were approaching a set of practices that had already spent centuries examining the wandering, tightening, and quieting of the mind from the inside. The path by which those practices entered the modern Western imagination was neither sudden nor simple. In the United States, specifically, Buddhist life can be traced back to Chinese immigrants on the West Coast in the 1840s, and then to further Japanese influence later in the 19th century. The World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893 altered that landscape in a visible way. And when Shakusoin returned to America in 1905 to lecture, he helped establish early ground for the arrival of Zen. What mattered here was not just the movement of ideas across oceans, but the gradual creation of a cultural setting in which meditation could be recognized as something more than an exotic curiosity. It was still foreign to most Americans, still filtered through misunderstanding, fascination, and uneven translation. Yet, it had begun to appear in the same intellectual horizon as religion, philosophy, psychology, and the problem of self-knowledge. In time, that horizon widened further. Accounts of Zen became part of literary and spiritual conversation. And by the 1950s, the number of Zen centers serving non-Asian Americans would grow from only a few to several hundred. Meditation was no longer only a distant report from another civilization. It had begun to acquire a local address. It was in this wider atmosphere that William James becomes such an important presence. Even though he was not a meditation researcher in the later experimental sense, in 1890, in the Principles of Psychology, James treated attention as one of the fundamental facts of mental life, something selective, effortful, and inseparable from the shape of experience itself. Then, in 1902, in the Varieties of Religious Experience, he took inward life seriously enough to place religious and mystical experience within the scope of serious intellectual discussion, rather than dismissing it as mere illusion or pathology. That did not make James a contemplative scientist in the modern style, but it did something just as important for the long history of this subject. It created a legitimate intellectual tone in which inner experience could be examined without being explained away. James understood that there are forms of knowing that arrive first as lived facts before they become clean theories, and that consciousness is not a static object, but an ongoing process shaped by habit, selection, memory, and will. In that sense, The later scientific study of meditation would inherit something from him, even when it moved far beyond him. It inherited permission to take the inner life seriously. James also sensed the difficulty that would haunt the field long after his own century. Attention could be described, but description was not the same as measurement. One person could report the effort of holding a thought steady, the intrusion of irrelevant ideas, the feeling that consciousness narrows and brightens around what it selects. Another could nod in recognition, yet the thing itself remained private. It unfolded in first person, while science preferred what could be inspected from the outside. This tension was not unique to meditation, but meditation sharpened it. A stone, a muscle, a wound. Even a heartbeat can be measured without requiring the subject to speak well about what it feels like. Meditation is different. Its most important events are often changes in noticing, in the quality of awareness, in the relation between thought and the one who seems to think. The problem is immediate and profound. If the most relevant data are experiential, how does science handle them without reducing them to something else? And if it refuses experience altogether, what exactly is it studying? The future science of meditation would spend decades circling these questions, but their outline was already visible in the age of James. For a long time, though that future had not yet arrived, meditation remained largely on the edges of Western scientific life, carried more by religious exchange, philosophical curiosity, and individual practice than by standardized laboratory programs. The people who encountered it in the first half of the 20th century often did so through books, lectures, teachers, or small communities, not through hospitals or neuroscience departments. This matters because it reminds us that the modern scientific question did not emerge in a vacuum. By the time doctors and psychologists began wondering whether meditation altered metabolism, emotion, attention, or the brain, the practice had already passed through decades of translation. Terms had shifted. Ritual settings had changed. What a monk did in a monastery, and what a Western intellectual imagined when hearing the word meditation, were not always the same thing. The research field that would later appear to be measuring a discrete object was, from the start, reaching towards something historically layered, culturally mobile, and difficult to define with precision. Even before the first major experiments, ambiguity was already part of the story. By the middle decades of the 20th century, that ambiguity had become more visible rather than less. Meditation in the West could suggest religious devotion, mystical aspiration, practical calm, self-transformation, countercultural rebellion, therapeutic hope, or intellectual fashion, depending on who was looking. Zen in particular acquired a powerful imaginative charge in American culture, though often in forms that simplified or romanticized its disciplinary and institutional realities. At the same time, the broader emergence of Buddhist and related contemplative practices in North America meant that more people were not merely reading about altered awareness, but attempting to cultivate it. The question slowly changed shape. No longer was meditation only a strange report from elsewhere. It became something that could be tried, failed at, repeated, and described by people living within the modern West itself. That shift matters for the science to come. Because once enough people begin practicing a technique close at hand, the demand for explanation changes. Curiosity becomes more practical. What is happening when the breath steadies and the mind does not? Why does attention seem trainable at all? Is the calm reported by some practitioners merely a feeling, or does it correspond to something that could be detected, charted, and compared. This was also the moment when the old boundary between spirituality and medicine began to look less secure. Historians of mindfulness have argued that the eventual rise of secular therapeutic programs did not appear out of nowhere. It was prepared by broader 20th century developments in health psychology, relaxation therapies, cross-cultural borrowing, and attempts to reframe contemplative practices in a language modern institutions could accept. That reframing had not yet reached its best-known form, but the conditions for it were gathering. Meditation could increasingly be imagined not only as a path within a religious tradition, but as a technique that might bear on stress, suffering, attention, and the body itself. This was a subtle but decisive change. Once meditation could be separated, even partly, from the full world of doctrine and ritual that had carried it for centuries, it became available for a new kind of scrutiny. It could be asked to justify itself not as wisdom, but as effect. It could be brought under the expectations of modern science, where claims must be operationalized, states distinguished from traits, and inner reports correlated with outward signs. In one sense, this was an opening. In another, it was the beginning of a long distortion, because something rich and historically dense was being prepared for translation into the narrower dialect of experiment. You can feel, at this threshold, how the subject is changing beneath our feet. The meditating figure in a temple, monastery, or simple room at home is still there, following breath or mantra, watching thought appear and dissolve. But now another scene comes into view beside it. A researcher waits with instruments. A physician wonders whether a subjective calm might leave a measurable trace in respiration or pulse. A psychologist, still haunted by the old problem of attention, senses that a deliberate practice of noticing might reveal something about the architecture of consciousness that ordinary life keeps hidden. Meditation is no longer only being lived. It is about to be handled, named, and divided into variables. The ancient practice has arrived at the door of the modern question. The change is quiet enough that it can be missed. Nothing dramatic announces it. There is only a shift in emphasis, from meaning to mechanism, from discipline to data, from inward report to outward sign. Yet once that shift begins, it will alter the entire destiny of the subject. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the first unmistakable signs of that new phase had appeared. In 1966, Akira Kasamatsu and Tomio Hirai published an electroencephalographic study of Zazen. In 1971, Robert Keith Wallace, Herbert Benson, and Archie Wilson published the now famous paper describing meditation as a wakeful, hypometabolic physiologic state. Those studies belong to the next movement of this story, where stillness enters the laboratory and the body becomes the first terrain on which meditation is scientifically translated. But their deeper significance can already be felt here, at the end of our opening descent. Before scientists could ask whether meditation changes the brain, they first had to decide what kind of event meditation was. Was it a religious state, a discipline of attention, a therapeutic technique, a cultural import, a physiological condition, or some unstable mixture of all of them? The answer was not waiting in the lab. It had to be built there, piece by piece, beginning not with enlightenment or wisdom, but with breath, pulse, and the measurable signatures of a body at rest that was somehow not resting in the ordinary way. And so the question moved inward only to reappear outside the body. If meditation could not yet be grasped as a clean theory of consciousness, perhaps it could be approached through breath, pulse, temperature, skin resistance. The electrical rhythms recorded across the scalp. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the room of inquiry changed its atmosphere. The temple, the retreat hall, the quiet corner of practice did not disappear. But beside them now stood laboratories with cables, electrodes, inked tracing paper, gas analyzers, stopwatches, and researchers trying to make an ancient inward discipline legible to modern instruments. The shift was subtle, almost modest in tone, yet it marked a profound turn. Scientists were no longer asking only what meditation meant. They were beginning to ask what it did. There is something almost tender about those early attempts. The technology was far less glamorous than the brain scans that would come later. No luminous images of the cortex. No dazzling maps of networks spread across conference screens. Only the patient logic of physiology. A person sat still while researchers measured respiration, heart rate, oxygen consumption, and changes in electrical activity. The body became the first common language between contemplative practice and biomedical science, perhaps because it seemed safer ground. Inner experience might be private, elusive, shaped by culture and vocabulary, but breathing could be counted. A pulse could be timed. A metabolic rate could be compared before and during practice. What could not yet be solved philosophically might at least be observed biologically. One of the earliest well-known efforts to do exactly this came from Japan. In 1966, Akira Kasamatsu and Tomio Hirai published an electroencephalographic study of Zazen, the seated meditation associated with Zen practice. Their work is often remembered because it represented a serious attempt to observe meditation not as mystical rumor, but as a trainable condition with measurable correlates. EEG research in those years already had a certain cultural prestige. Brainwaves offered the seductive possibility that states of mind might have visible signatures, patterns that could be registered without relying entirely on a person's account of what he or she felt. Kasamatsu and Hirai reported changes in electrical rhythms during Zazen and suggested that experience mattered, that the brains of more seasoned practitioners did not simply resemble those of novices resting quietly with eyes closed. It was an intriguing result, though still a preliminary one, and it quietly planted an idea that would keep returning in new forms for decades. Perhaps meditation was not merely a belief about the mind. Perhaps it was a practice that left traces. Even so, those traces did not speak for themselves. EEG lines on paper could suggest altered states of attention or relaxation, but interpretation remained delicate. Was the meditator entering a form of wakeful calm, unlike ordinary rest, or simply becoming drowsy? Were the recorded shifts signs of deeper concentration, or reflections of posture, eye closure, breathing, and expectation? These were not trivial questions. They reveal how early the science of meditation confronted its most persistent difficulty. Instruments can register change, but they do not automatically tell us what kind of change it is. In a field built around subjective training, the temptation to read meaning too quickly into physiology was always close at hand. Still, those Japanese studies mattered because they legitimized a style of inquiry. Meditation had crossed a threshold. It was now possible, at least in principle, to study stillness with the tools of experimental science. A few years later, that threshold widened. In 1971, Robert Keith Wallace, Herbert Benson, and Archie Wilson published a paper that would become one of the most frequently cited landmarks in early meditation research. Working with practitioners of transcendental meditation, They described what they called a wakeful hypometabolic physiologic state. The phrase is memorable because it captures the peculiar quality researchers believed they were seeing. Here was a condition in which the body seemed to settle into a lower level of metabolic activity, while the subject remained awake rather than slipping into sleep. Oxygen consumption decreased, breathing slowed. Certain autonomic measures shifted in the direction of calm. The body appeared to be resting, but not in the ordinary way one rests while dozing or drifting toward unconsciousness. That difference gave the findings their fascination. Meditation seemed to occupy a borderland. It was neither ordinary waking activity nor sleep, neither simple passivity nor obvious exertion. Imagine the appeal of that claim at the time. Western medicine had long been comfortable with conditions that could be placed into familiar categories. A person was active or inactive, aroused or sedated, asleep or awake. But meditation seemed to blur those oppositions. It suggested that conscious intention could guide the body into a quieter physiological mode without extinguishing awareness. For researchers interested in stress, psychosomatic illness, and autonomic regulation, this was not just an exotic footnote about Eastern spirituality. It hinted at a new possibility within human self-regulation itself. The mind, or at least attention shaped by training, might be able to alter processes previously assumed to be mostly automatic. That did not mean the mystery was solved. If anything, it deepened. A practice that had once been framed in moral or spiritual terms now began to look like a problem in biomedicine. Herbert Benson would become central to that transformation. A Harvard-affiliated physician with a strong interest in cardiovascular physiology, Benson was drawn to questions of stress at a time when the language of modern life increasingly revolved around tension, overload, and the toll of chronic arousal. The wider medical culture was already prepared, in part, for someone like him. Hans Selye's work had made stress into a powerful organizing concept, and American medicine was growing more attentive to the ways psychological states seem to influence blood pressure, heart function, and general well-being. Benson's significance lies partly in the fact that he did not treat meditation as a foreign curiosity to be admired from afar. He treated it as an opportunity to identify a reproducible bodily response. That was a distinctly modern move. Rather than asking whether a specific spiritual tradition was true, he asked whether a certain pattern of mental repetition and quiet attention could trigger physiological effects with clinical relevance. This is where the scientific story becomes especially revealing. Researchers like Benson did not need to settle the full metaphysical status of meditation in order to study it. They only needed to isolate elements that seemed experimentally tractable. A word, a sound, a phrase repeated silently, a passive attitude toward intrusive thoughts, a comfortable posture, decreased muscular effort. In other words, the part of the practice that could be abstracted from its doctrinal setting and translated into procedural steps. Something important is gained by this method, because it makes systematic testing possible, but something is also lost. The rich world in which contemplative practice had traditionally lived, with its ethics, communities, cosmologies, and long training arcs, is narrowed into a handful of variables. That narrowing is not accidental. It is part of how modern science works. The question is whether what remains is the heart of the thing, or only its most measurable shell. Benson's later formulation of the relaxation response made that tension even clearer. The phrase itself is elegant and practical, almost impossibly successful in its simplicity, against the familiar stress response. Here was a built-in human capacity for physiological quieting, one that could be intentionally evoked through certain forms of focused repetition and mental settling. In one sense, the term was a triumph of translation. It allowed meditation-like practices to enter the vocabulary of doctors, patients, and the public without requiring them to adopt a religious worldview. In another sense, it recast meditation within the expectations of late 20th century medicine. The contemplative exercise was increasingly valued because it could reduce arousal, influence cardiovascular parameters, and perhaps help address stress-related conditions. A person did not have to seek enlightenment to become interesting to a laboratory. It was enough to lower respiration and alter oxygen use. That change in framing shaped the whole field that followed. The early physiological studies rarely asked whether meditation made people wiser, kinder, or less attached to the illusion of a permanent self. They asked whether something in the body shifted reliably during practice. This was both a reduction and a breakthrough. Reduction, because the old contemplative ambitions were being set aside or bracketed. Breakthrough, because the terms of the conversation had changed in a way Western institutions could accept. Once meditation could be spoken of as a bodily state rather than a purely religious act. Hospitals and clinics had a reason to listen. A phenomenon that had seemed vague, private, and culturally distant was beginning to produce numbers. That gave it a different kind of authority. Yet even at this stage, uncertainty had not vanished. The early literature contained enthusiasm, but it also contained ambiguity that later generations would recognize more sharply. Different traditions used different methods, yet the word meditation was often allowed to cover them all. Some studies involved highly trained practitioners. Others involved more ordinary volunteers, resting quietly, closing the eyes, slowing the breath, repeating a sound, cultivating alert awareness, and moving toward deep concentration are not identical acts. And their bodily correlates need not be identical either. Moreover, many early studies were small. Control conditions were not always as rigorous as later standards would demand. The atmosphere around the work could be colored by hope, by the charisma of particular movements, or by the sheer novelty of bringing contemplative practice into a lab. None of this makes the findings worthless. It simply reminds us that the first scientific encounter with meditation was exploratory, not definitive. There was also a subtler conceptual problem. Even if researchers could demonstrate decreased oxygen consumption or slower respiration during practice, what had they really explained? A physiological profile is not the same thing as a theory of experience. One could say that the body had entered a quieter condition, but that did not yet clarify the relation between that condition and the felt texture of awareness. Was the person calmer because metabolic demand fell? Or did the metabolic changes reflect a prior shift in attention? Did bodily quieting constitute the essence of meditation? Or was it only one surface consequence among many? The earliest physiological research left these questions largely open. It gave science a foothold, not a summit. Stillness had been translated into measurement, but the meaning of what was measured remained partly unsettled. And yet, that foothold mattered more than it may first appear. Once meditation became associated with reproducible changes in respiration, metabolism, and autonomic activity, it no longer looked like something beyond the proper reach of modern inquiry. A door had opened between contemplative practice and the institutional world of medicine. Physicians could now imagine meditation as relevant to hypertension, stress disorders, anxiety, or chronic illness. Psychologists could wonder whether attentional training might carry measurable effects into emotional life. Researchers in psychophysiology could begin asking whether these bodily shifts differed from sleep, hypnosis, ordinary rest, or simple expectation? The questions became more precise because the object had become more tangible. Meditation was still difficult to define, but it was harder now to dismiss. It is worth pausing over how strange this transition really was. For centuries, the authority surrounding meditation had largely come from teachers, traditions, communities of practice, and the testimony of those who had submitted themselves to discipline over time. Now a second form of authority began to gather around it. Quieter, but in some ways more powerful in modern public life. The authority of the measured body. A graph on a laboratory printout could travel into medical journals, lectures, public discussion, and eventually mass media. The contemplative practitioner and the biomedical subject had begun to overlap. The person sitting quietly with closed eyes might also be a patient, a volunteer, a data point, a case study, or the first hint of a new therapeutic possibility. The center of gravity was shifting, and that shift would soon carry meditation into yet another transformation. Once scientists and physicians believed that contemplative practice produced measurable effects in the body, the next step followed almost naturally. If the response could be induced, standardized, taught, and separated from its older cultural packaging, then meditation might become more than a subject of laboratory curiosity. It might enter clinics, hospitals, and structured programs designed for ordinary people living modern lives. Stillness, once translated into physiology, was now ready to be translated again into medicine itself. And once stillness had been rendered into respiration, pulse, and metabolic change, another possibility emerged almost quietly from within the medical imagination. If a contemplative practice could produce bodily effects under laboratory conditions, then perhaps it did not have to remain a curious object on the margins of psychophysiology. Perhaps it could be adapted, standardized, taught, and placed inside institutions built not for monks or retreatants, but for patients. That shift required more than evidence. It required translation. The laboratory had shown that meditation might leave measurable traces in the body. Medicine now had to decide whether such a practice could survive the journey into clinics and hospitals without losing the very thing that made it distinct. That journey would depend on a particular kind of person, someone able to move between worlds that were not naturally comfortable with one another. A hospital does not speak the language of liberation from suffering in the classical Buddhist sense. It speaks of symptoms, prognosis, compliance, treatment, outcomes, and risk. It expects protocols. It prefers language that sounds neutral, universal, and practical. A contemplative tradition, by contrast, is often carried by concepts shaped over centuries, by ethical commitments, by communities of practice, and by goals that do not fit easily into the vocabulary of modern biomedicine. For meditation to enter medicine, something had to be removed. Something had to be preserved, and much had to be renamed. No figure stands more centrally in that transformation than Jon Kabat-Zinn. Trained as a molecular biologist at MIT, influenced by Zen and Buddhist practice, and moving within an American culture increasingly marked by stress, chronic illness, and interest in mind-body approaches, Kabat-Zinn occupied an unusual position from the start. He was scientifically trained, but his interest in meditation was not a detached academic fascination. He practiced, he understood, from inside the tradition, that these methods were not merely pleasant techniques for calming down. Yet he also seems to have recognized that if they were presented to mainstream medicine in their traditional form, complete with overt religious framing and unfamiliar terminology, they would likely remain outside the institutional center. In 1979, at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, he founded what became the Stress Reduction Clinic. The timing mattered. American medicine in the late 20th century was beginning to confront large populations of patients whose suffering could not always be neatly solved by surgery, pharmaceuticals, or acute interventions. Chronic pain, anxiety, recurring stress-related complaints, and the diffuse burdens of modern life were not rare exceptions. They were becoming normal features of clinical reality. A setting like that created an opening for something that was neither exactly conventional psychotherapy nor classic internal medicine, but a disciplined practice that patients could engage for themselves. Kabat-Zinn's insight was that meditation could be reshaped into that role. The program that emerged, Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, or MBSR, would become one of the most influential developments in the modern history of meditation. Yet its importance lies as much in its form as in its content. MBSR was not introduced as an invitation to convert, nor as a simplified religion in disguise, at least not in the way its public presentation was carefully built. It was offered as a structured course, grounded in deliberate attention, body awareness, gentle yoga, sitting practice, and non-judgmental observation of experience. The word mindfulness itself proved remarkably useful here. It carried fewer overt theological associations for secular Western audiences, while still pointing toward a disciplined way of relating to thought, sensation, and emotion. An old practice had found a new passport. There was a strategic intelligence in that language. Kabat-Zinn has written openly, in later reflections, that the program was designed to make the essence of these practices available in medical settings, without requiring patients or clinicians to step into a specifically Buddhist framework. This was not a casual softening of vocabulary. It was a deliberate act of cultural and institutional engineering. Terms with heavy doctrinal weight were set aside. The rhetoric of enlightenment disappeared from the clinic. What remained were practices that could be described in phenomenological, psychological, and practical terms. Attention to the present moment. Awareness of breath and body. A changed relationship to pain, stress, and thought. One can feel here both the generosity and the controversy of the move. Something subtle was being preserved, but only by being reformulated. If you imagine entering one of those early classes, the atmosphere would have felt very different from the physiological laboratories of the previous section. There were no gas analyzers tracing oxygen consumption, no immediate emphasis on brain waves or cardiovascular measurements. Instead, there were people whose lives had become painful, constricted, overloaded, or uncertain, being asked to stop for long enough to feel the body they ordinarily hurried past. Some arrived with chronic pain that medicine had not fully relieved. Others came under the burden of stress or illness. The intervention was not framed as mystical attainment. It was framed as training. A person could learn to sit with discomfort without immediately fleeing it, to notice the rise and fall of anxious thought, to encounter the moment before reaction becomes habit. The setting was clinical, but the invitation was inward. That, in a sense, was the great gamble. Could an institution built around treatment absorb a discipline originally tied to a broader vision of human suffering and liberation? Could meditation become legible as healthcare without collapsing into a mere technique of self-soothing? The answer, historically, is complicated. MBSR succeeded in part because it did not ask medicine to become spiritually adventurous. It asked medicine to consider that a patient's way of attending to experience might itself be therapeutically relevant. That was a manageable proposal, and a powerful one. It resonated with the growing recognition that chronic stress and chronic suffering were not adequately captured by a model concerned only with tissue damage or acute pathology. As the program spread, mindfulness began to acquire a distinctly modern identity. It could now be taught in 8-week courses, evaluated in studies, adapted for hospitals, and introduced to patients who may never have set foot in a temple or meditation center. This was one of the decisive moments in the subject's history. Meditation was no longer appearing in medicine only as an odd physiological state. It was becoming an intervention. That difference matters. A state can be observed. An intervention can be delivered, replicated, and eventually recommended. With that shift, meditation left behind the role of interesting phenomenon and moved closer to becoming part of the therapeutic landscape. Still, translation always has a cost. In classical contemplative settings, meditation is rarely an isolated tool. It sits within moral training, communal life, teacher-student relationships, metaphysical assumptions, and long arcs of transformation that are not primarily aimed at lowering stress. The clinic could not import all of that, nor would it have wished to, so the practice was thinned, though one might also say clarified, depending on one's perspective. Ethical language softened into non-judgmental awareness. Soteriological goals gave way to symptom relief and enhanced well-being. The disciplined examination of craving, aversion, and selfhood survived, but often in gentler and more psychologically accessible forms. Some saw this as a brilliant act of adaptation. Others would later argue that what entered medicine under the name mindfulness had been detached from crucial elements that originally gave it coherence and depth. Those tensions were not merely philosophical side notes. They affected how the practice was understood, studied, and sold. If mindfulness was presented as universal, secular, and compatible with any worldview, it became easier to disseminate widely. But universal language can conceal history. It can make a culturally situated discipline appear as though it had always existed in a neutral scientific form, waiting to be discovered by medicine. That was never quite true. Mindfulness entered hospitals through acts of selection and reformulation. It was not simply found there. It was built there, and yet, from another angle. That building process answered a real need. Many patients did not require or want a full immersion in Buddhist philosophy. They needed a way to live with pain, fear, stress, cancer treatment, uncertainty, or persistent emotional strain. For them, the stripped down and structured character of MBSR may have been precisely what made it useful. One of the persistent features of modern medicine is that it must work with people of radically different convictions and backgrounds. A hospital-based program cannot assume a shared cosmology. In that setting, the secular presentation of mindfulness was not only a strategic choice, it was a practical necessity. The spread of MBSR also altered the kinds of research that became possible. Once a program is standardized, researchers can begin to study it as an identifiable intervention, rather than a loose family of contemplative activities. Participants can be enrolled before and after a defined course. Outcomes can be measured. Comparisons can be attempted. A whole new research architecture opens up. But here again, translation shapes evidence. Scientists were no longer simply asking what happens during meditative states. They were beginning to ask whether a package of practices, delivered through a structured program in clinical settings, could reduce suffering in measurable ways. That is a different question, and in many ways a more institutionally consequential one. It was around this time that mindfulness began to move from the language of stress reduction toward a closer relationship with psychotherapy. The border between contemplative training and cognitive models of emotional vulnerability proved unusually fertile. Depression, in particular, presented a challenge that many clinicians knew too well. Even when major depressive episodes lifted, the risk of relapse remained disturbingly high. Patients often found themselves drawn back into the same loops of rumination, self-judgment, and mental habit that had carried them downward before. The question was no longer only how to help someone feel calmer in the present, but how to alter the habitual relationship to thought itself. Out of that problem came another important act of adaptation: mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, developed by Zindel Segal, Mark Williams, and John Teasdale, drew together elements of cognitive therapy and mindfulness practice to address recurrent depression. The insight here was subtle and profound. A person vulnerable to depression may not need every painful thought to disappear. What may matter more is learning to encounter those thoughts without immediately entering their logic, without treating each one as a command or a revelation. In that sense, mindfulness was not being used simply to produce relaxation. It was being used to change a person's relation to mental content, to help someone notice the onset of depressive thinking without being fully absorbed into it. That move took mindfulness deeper into the heart of modern psychology. With MBCT, the medical translation of meditation reached a new level of legitimacy. This was no longer only a matter of stress and general well-being, fields that can sometimes be dismissed as vague or easily commercialized. Recurrent depression is a serious clinical problem, and the evidence that mindfulness-based approaches could help reduce relapse among certain patients gave the field a different kind of credibility. Institutions began to pay closer attention. Guideline bodies would later recommend mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for people with a history of repeated depressive episodes under appropriate conditions. The quiet practice that had once seemed culturally distant now stood inside evidence-based mental health care. Something important changed in public perception at this point. Meditation had already been translated into physiology. It was now being translated into treatment pathways. The person doing mindfulness in a hospital program or therapeutic context no longer looked like a seeker on a spiritual path in any obvious public sense. He or she looked increasingly like an ordinary participant in healthcare, someone referred for pain management, stress-related suffering, or vulnerability to depressive relapse. This normalized meditation in a powerful way. It placed contemplative practice within the everyday architecture of modern suffering. But normalization can conceal unresolved questions. What exactly was doing the work in these programs? Was it sustained attention to present moment experience, group support, instructor warmth, expectation and hope, repeated exposure to difficult sensations? Cognitive change brought about through a new stance toward thought. Perhaps all of these were involved. In clinical life, the success of an intervention often precedes full clarity about its mechanisms. That is not unusual. Still, it meant that mindfulness entered medicine carrying a curious dual identity. It was at once ancient and newly engineered, inwardly subtle and institutionally standardized, presented as secular but shaped by contemplative traditions, supported by emerging evidence, yet still conceptually elusive. One can also feel, beneath the spread of these programs, a broader cultural transformation. Late 20th century societies were generating forms of distress that seemed to call for methods of self-regulation. Work accelerated. Chronic stress became ordinary. Attention itself began to feel fractured and overdrawn. In that environment, mindfulness seemed to offer something medicine and psychology were both searching for: a disciplined, reproducible way of turning toward experience rather than merely escaping it. Whether that promise was fully understood or later exaggerated is a question that would grow more pressing with time. For now, what matters is that the clinical translation succeeded. Hospitals, therapists, patients, and researchers had begun to treat meditative practice as a serious and practical part of modern care. And once that happened, the terms of the conversation shifted again. A standardized intervention invites stronger kinds of validation. A therapy used in hospitals inevitably attracts the attention of researchers looking for mechanisms, biomarkers, and neural correlates. The clinical world had made mindfulness respectable. The next stage would make it visible in a new and more seductive way. As medicine absorbed these practices and psychology found uses for them, neuroscience was preparing to ask a question the earlier physiological studies could only approach indirectly. If training attention and awareness could alter stress, mood, and the felt structure of experience, then what exactly might be happening in the brain while all this was unfolding? By the time meditation reached the world of neuroscience, its status had already changed. It was no longer merely a curious inward practice, nor only a therapeutic method finding cautious acceptance in clinics and hospitals. A new possibility had come into view, one that felt far more powerful in the modern imagination. If meditation could be studied through the brain, then it might finally seem visible in the most convincing language contemporary science possessed. That mattered because brain imaging arrived with a kind of authority earlier forms of measurement rarely held. Breathing patterns, heart rate, and oxygen consumption could suggest that something meaningful was happening during meditation. But they did not easily capture public attention. A brain scan did. It looked immediate, visual, intimate, and objective all at once. For researchers, it offered a new set of tools. For the public, it offered something even more compelling: the feeling that an ancient inner discipline might at last be seen from the outside. To understand why this mattered so much, it helps to remember how the brain had begun to occupy the center of public explanation during those years. Across psychology, psychiatry, education, and popular science, there was a rising appetite for accounts that linked behavior and experience to visible neural processes. The colorful language of hardwiring, rewiring, circuits, and plasticity began moving far beyond specialist journals. A finding about the brain did not stay inside the lab for long. It traveled into newspapers, magazine features, book tours, medical talks, and eventually the growing digital culture of self-improvement. Meditation, having already crossed into medicine, was now approaching the most persuasive visual language of the age. Few figures are more central to this chapter than Richard Davidson. Trained as a neuroscientist and known for his work on emotion and affective style, Davidson had already established himself within mainstream science before meditation became one of his defining interests. That matters because he was not operating from the margins. He was not a mystic trying to borrow credibility from science. He was a scientist whose work on emotion gave him a route toward questions many others still regarded as unusual. If emotional life could be studied as patterns of brain function, And if attention and mental training shaped emotional regulation, then the contemplative traditions might contain something science had barely begun to explore. Davidson's path into this field is often linked to his encounters with the Dalai Lama and to the broader mind and life dialogues, which brought scientists and contemplative practitioners into sustained conversation. These meetings are easy to romanticize, but their deeper importance lies elsewhere. They altered the range of questions some researchers felt authorized to ask. Modern neuroscience had devoted immense energy to anxiety, depression, fear, damage, dysregulation, and all the many ways a mind can go wrong. The Dalai Lama famously asked why science spent so much time studying affliction and so little time studying compassion, well-being, and trainable qualities of the mind. One does not have to turn that moment into a dramatic revelation to see its effect. It helped make a new line of inquiry feel intellectually serious. That shift was significant because it moved meditation research out of a narrow corner. Earlier work had often framed contemplative practice in terms of stress reduction, autonomic change, or clinical symptom relief. Those were important entry points. But they also kept the field somewhat close to medicine's familiar concerns. Davidson and others opened a wider horizon. Meditation could now be studied as mental training, not merely as a calming technique. The brain might be changed by repeated cultivation of attention, compassion, awareness, or emotional balance. Once framed that way, the subject no longer belonged only to stress clinics and mind-body medicine. It belonged to the science of human potential, self-regulation, and neuroplasticity. That last word carried extraordinary weight. Neuroplasticity was not a new discovery in the simple sense, but during these years it acquired growing symbolic power. The old image of the adult brain as relatively fixed had been giving way to a more dynamic understanding. Neural systems could change with learning, practice, injury, and experience. For the public, the idea was irresistible. It suggested that identity was less settled than once believed. Habits, skills, even vulnerabilities might be reshaped. If meditation could be placed inside that framework, then it no longer looked like an ancient spiritual discipline awkwardly borrowed by the modern world. It looked like a method for training the brain. There is a certain logic to what happened next. If contemplative practice might alter neural function, researchers needed people whose training was substantial enough to reveal something clearer than a few minutes of casual relaxation. Long-term practitioners became especially valuable. They were, in a sense, living archives of sustained mental exercise. A violinist who has practiced for years may show traces of training in perception and motor systems. A London taxi driver who has mastered the city's spatial complexity may show differences related to navigation. By analogy, a contemplative with tens of thousands of hours of practice might offer a glimpse into what repeated cultivation of attention and awareness could do over time. That reasoning drew scientists toward expert meditators with a mixture of curiosity and caution. One of the most widely cited moments in this part of the story came in 2004, when Antoine Lutz and colleagues published a paper in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examining long-term Buddhist practitioners during compassion meditation. The study reported unusually high amplitude gamma synchrony, a form of rhythmic neural activity associated with coordinated processing across brain regions, along with patterns that appeared stronger in experienced meditators than in novice controls. For many readers, the finding had an almost cinematic quality. Here were brains that seemed to display, in measurable electrical form, the results of intensive contemplative training. meditation was no longer merely slowing the body. It appeared to be shaping the dynamics of neural coordination itself. At this stage, even careful science was entering a more symbolically charged environment. Gamma synchrony is a technical matter, subtle in meaning and not easy to reduce to a slogan. Yet the public did what the public often does with complex neuroscience. It reached for the larger story. If expert meditators showed unusual patterns during compassion practice, perhaps compassion itself was trainable in a deep biological sense. Perhaps the contemplative traditions had discovered, long ago, methods for altering the brain in ways science was only beginning to detect. These were not irrational extrapolations, but they moved faster than the science itself. A few striking findings, especially when paired with the moral appeal of compassion and the cultural interest surrounding Tibetan Buddhism, could generate an enormous amount of imaginative momentum. Around the same period, another set of results deepened that momentum. In 2005, Sarah Lazar and colleagues reported structural differences in cortical thickness associated with meditation experience. The idea was instantly compelling. Brain activity during a task can feel transient, a momentary snapshot of something happening in real time. But structural differences suggest durability. They imply that practice may have left a more enduring mark, something closer to the physical architecture of the brain than to a passing state. For a culture already captivated by self-improvement and neural plasticity, this kind of result was almost perfectly designed to travel. Sitting quietly, day after day, might not only calm the mind, it might literally reshape the tissue through which the mind works. That phrase, reshape the brain, would soon become one of the most powerful and problematic currents in the whole field. It contained a truth, or at least a possible one, but also a temptation. Structural imaging can reveal group differences, yet group differences are not the same as direct proof of causal transformation. Experienced meditators may differ from non-meditators in many ways besides practice history. They may have distinct lifestyles, temperaments, sleep patterns, education levels, or pre-existing dispositions that influenced both their attraction to meditation and the characteristics of their brains. Cross-sectional studies can raise provocative questions. They do not always settle them. Still, at the level of public imagination, such caution is fragile. Once the phrase meditation changes, brain structure begins circulating. Nuance often follows some distance behind. If the structural studies suggested durability, work on the default mode network gave the field a language for something many practitioners recognized from within. In 2011, Judson Brewer and colleagues published findings linking meditation experience to alterations in activity within this network, which is often associated with self-referential thought, mind wandering, autobiographical processing, and the kind of mental drifting that fills so much of ordinary life. The appeal here was immediate. Almost anyone who has tried to sit quietly knows the peculiar restlessness of unbidden thinking, the way the mind slips into remembering, planning, rehearsing, worrying, narrating. To connect meditation with changes in this domain of neural activity was to bring modern brain language into close contact with a very old contemplative observation. The mind wanders. Training changes the relation to that wandering. That bridge between subjective report and neural language was one of the reasons the scanner became so seductive. Earlier physiological research had shown that meditation could affect the body, and clinical work had shown that structured programs might help people live differently with stress, pain, or vulnerability to depression. But neuroimaging seemed to offer something richer. It appeared to connect what practitioners described from the inside with patterns researchers could visualize from the outside. A person says that mental chatter has quieted, that attention has grown steadier, that reactivity has changed. A scan seems to show altered activity in regions or networks relevant to those very processes. The result is immensely persuasive, perhaps more persuasive than it should be. Correlation feels like explanation when the picture is beautiful enough. Part of the beauty came from the cultural status of the technologies themselves. Functional MRI and other imaging methods do not merely produce data. They produce representations that look, to non-specialists, like windows into hidden truth. Colored areas on a brain image have a rhetorical power that breathing measurements and pulse rates rarely achieve. They feel explanatory, even when they remain highly inferential. This is not a flaw in the machines. It is part of the way modern visual culture interacts with science. An image of neural activity seems to show the mind laid bare. In reality, it shows something more abstract and more mediated. A complex reconstruction derived from blood flow, statistical comparison, task design, and interpretation. Yet once those images entered the meditation story, they transformed its public life. By then, contemplative neuroscience had acquired a kind of intellectual glamour. Meditation was no longer just a therapeutic add-on or a physiologic curiosity. It had become a meeting point between monks and scanners, ancient disciplines and modern imaging, compassion training and cortical activity. There was something almost narratively perfect about it. A person sits silently, does almost nothing visible, and yet behind that stillness, the brain seems to reorganize itself. This matched a deep modern longing, the hope that inward effort might yield measurable outer change, that ancient wisdom might finally be validated by the most advanced tools of contemporary science. At the same time, the field was not moving without friction. The involvement of high-profile contemplative figures, especially the Dalai Lama, inspired admiration in some quarters and resistance in others. When the Society for Neuroscience invited the Dalai Lama to speak in 2005, more than 500 scientists signed a protest petition. Their concerns varied, but at the center was a discomfort with bringing a religious and political figure into such a prominent scientific setting. The moment is easy to read as a clash between old dogmatism and enlightened openness, but the reality was more complex. Some researchers feared a blurring of boundaries, a confusion between scientific rigor and spiritual enthusiasm. Others saw fruitful dialogue, a chance to widen the moral and intellectual imagination of the field. The controversy revealed that meditation research was not only about data, it was also about who gets to frame scientific curiosity and how far science can move toward contemplative traditions without feeling that it has compromised itself. That tension, in a quieter form, ran through much of the neuroscience of meditation. Researchers were trying to study practices that came with rich first-person descriptions, cultural narratives, and long histories of interpretation. Yet the scanner has no interest in doctrine. It only records what it is built to record. So a gap remained. Even in the most compelling studies, neural changes might be linked to compassion training, open monitoring, focused attention, or non-dual awareness. But those labels carry layers of meaning that imaging alone cannot fully resolve. The science was becoming more sophisticated, yet the object of study remained difficult to define cleanly. Meditation was many things at once, and the brain data, however striking, did not dissolve that complexity. Still, one should not underestimate how much these years changed the cultural standing of the whole subject. By the time structural studies, EEG work, and network-level findings had circulated through journals and media, a new common assumption was taking shape. Meditation was no longer simply believed to be good for stress. It was increasingly treated as a form of brain training. The phrase sounded modern, efficient, and evidence-based. It also fit neatly with the larger rise of self-optimization culture. Attention could be trained. Emotion could be regulated. The restless narrative activity of the mind might be softened. The brain itself, according to the emerging story, was plastic enough to respond. That story was not false, but it was becoming smoother than the evidence warranted. Different studies examined different practices, different populations, and different outcome measures. Long-term practitioners were sometimes compared with novices. 8-week programs were sometimes discussed in the same breath as decades of contemplative life. State effects during meditation were mingled in public conversation with trait-like changes that might persist away from the cushion. The rhetoric of rewiring began to flatten those distinctions, and the flattening mattered. A compelling narrative was forming. But what exactly was being changed? Under which conditions? And by what mechanisms remained far from settled. For the moment, however, the seduction held. The scanner seemed to have done something extraordinary. It had turned meditation into visible neuroscience, and in doing so, it gave the field a new level of prestige and public fascination. The old image of the practitioner sitting silently in a room was now shadowed by another image, equally powerful in its own way. The brain as a living landscape, shaped by training, lit by attention, carrying traces of inner discipline that science could finally begin to see. And once that enchantment took hold, the next question became harder to avoid. If the images were as persuasive as they seemed, then what? In precise terms, were they actually showing? Was meditation changing attention, pain, emotional reactivity, self-referential thinking, structural anatomy, or simply the way scientists and the public interpreted a very complicated set of findings? Once the scanner had done its work on the imagination, a quieter and more difficult phase of the story began. Images could suggest that something important was happening, and they often did. But after the first wave of fascination, a more demanding question settled over the field. When researchers said meditation changes the brain, what exactly were they referring to? A passing shift in neural activity while someone was meditating, a more durable alteration in attention or emotional response, a difference in how pain was experienced, a change in the sense of self, or, more subtly still, a change in the language scientists use to describe a complicated set of observations that did not fit easily into a single category. This question may sound technical at first, but in truth, it reaches very close to the lived reality of practice. Anyone who has tried to meditate for more than a few days knows that experience does not improve in one simple direction. Some sessions feel scattered, others strangely clear. Attention can seem stronger one week and more unruly the next. Pain in the legs may become more noticeable rather than less. Emotional life does not always become calmer in a straight line. So when science tries to ask what meditation changes, it is meeting a phenomenon that is already uneven from the inside. The challenge is not only to detect effects, it is to separate kinds of effects that overlap in life, but differ in theory, in timescale, and in measurement. One of the most useful distinctions researchers had to learn was the difference between state and trait. A state effect is something that happens during or immediately around the practice itself. Breathing slows. Attention narrows. Self-referential thinking quiets for a time. Brain activity shifts while the person is engaged in a specific technique. A trait effect is more ambitious. It suggests that after repeated training, the person carries something altered into ordinary life. Attention may become more stable away from formal practice. Emotional reactivity may soften in daily situations. The tendency to be captured by certain thoughts may lessen even when one is not meditating. That distinction sounds simple, yet much confusion entered the field because the two were often blurred together. A long-term practitioner in a scanner may show an unusual neural pattern while actively engaged in compassion practice or focused attention. That finding can be valuable, but it does not automatically prove that the person's resting mind, daily character, or enduring brain organization is changed in the same way. Likewise, a beginner who reports feeling calmer after an 8-week course may indeed have experienced something meaningful, but the source of that change might lie in many places at once. It could reflect attention training, group support, expectation, relief at taking time out from ordinary stress, or the first fragile growth of a new habit of observing thought. The field kept returning to the same tension. Researchers wanted clean categories. Meditation kept offering layered experience instead. Attention seemed, at first, like the clearest place to start. Many forms of contemplative practice involve returning again and again to a chosen object. Perhaps the breath, sound, bodily sensation, or open awareness itself. From a psychological perspective, this made meditation look like a kind of repeated exercise in regulating selection. You notice distraction, disengage from it, and reorient. That cycle is simple to describe and rich in implications. It touches sustained attention, conflict monitoring, meta-awareness, and the capacity to catch the mind wandering before it disappears too far into its own stories. These are exactly the kinds of processes cognitive science knows how to take seriously. Over time, researchers began trying to measure these attentional changes more directly. Some studies suggested that meditation training could improve aspects of sustained attention or reduce susceptibility to certain forms of distraction. Others found more modest or mixed results, depending on the task, the population, and the type of practice under investigation. That unevenness mattered. It suggested that attention was not one thing, and that meditation was not one intervention. Focused attention practices, open monitoring, loving kindness, body scan techniques, and mantra repetition may overlap in important ways, but they do not train identical skills, even within a single tradition. The cognitive demands can change across stages of practice. A field eager for global claims was running into a phenomenon built out of differences. Still, one finding kept drawing particular interest. Meditation seemed closely related to changes in the experience of mind wandering. This was one reason the default mode network became so influential in public discussion. The appeal was not merely technical. The phrase offered neuroscience a way to speak to something deeply familiar. Much of human life is spent in spontaneous inner narration, drifting across memory, anticipation, rehearsal, fantasy, worry, and self-commentary. Contemplative traditions had long noticed that this restless movement is not incidental. It is one of the central conditions through which suffering, craving, anxiety, and self-making are continually sustained. If meditation altered the relation to that ongoing mental activity, then a change in default mode patterns seemed like a plausible neural companion to a very old introspective claim. Yet even here, caution was needed. A reduction in activity within one network during a specific meditative state does not exhaust the meaning of reduced mind wandering. It does not fully explain whether the person has become more attentive, less self-absorbed, more emotionally balanced, or simply more practiced at performing a task inside a scanner. Nor does it clarify what kind of self-reference is being reduced. Human inward life is not made only of useless chatter. Reflection, autobiographical memory, imagination, and narrative identity can all be valuable. So the scientific question had to become finer. Was meditation weakening maladaptive rumination, altering habitual self-focus, or merely producing a temporary state of reduced discursive thought? The answer could differ across practices and across people. Pain presented another route into this complexity, and in some ways a more revealing one. Stress and attention are important topics, but pain has a special power in the science of meditation because it is at once bodily and subjective. It can be experimentally induced. It can be rated. It can be linked to behavior, expectation, physiology, and neural processing. Most importantly, it forces researchers to confront a distinction between sensation and suffering that contemplative traditions had explored in their own language for centuries. The raw signal of discomfort is one thing. The mental cascade that grows around it, anticipation, resistance, fear, story, is another. This made pain research especially attractive to scientists trying to understand whether mindfulness had a mechanism distinct from ordinary relaxation or placebo. If someone trained in mindfulness reports less suffering during painful stimulation, what has changed? Has the intensity of sensation itself decreased? Has the emotional reaction changed while the sensory signal remains? Has expectation softened the experience in a non-specific way? Or has attention altered the person's relation to the incoming experience? Perhaps by reducing the secondary wave of appraisal that often magnifies pain into distress. These were not small questions. They cut close to the heart of what many contemplative traditions had claimed all along. That suffering is shaped not only by what is felt, but by how experience is met. Research in this area began to suggest something intriguing. Mindfulness-based pain relief did not always look identical to simple distraction, ordinary relaxation, or placebo expectation. In some studies, participants trained in mindfulness reported changes in pain experience alongside neural patterns that researchers argued were distinguishable from placebo mechanisms. Such findings were attractive precisely because they seemed to offer specificity. The field had long risked collapsing meditation into a vague category of calming influence. Pain studies hinted that the story might be more precise. Mindfulness could involve a trained form of contact with experience that changed the processing of pain without merely turning away from it. But even here, the ground remained complicated. Experimentally induced pain in laboratory settings is not the same thing as chronic pain lived for years within the structure of a person's life. A healthy volunteer receiving controlled heat stimulation may benefit from a specific attentional strategy in ways that do not map neatly onto someone with persistent illness, fear of recurrence, insomnia, depression, medication use, and long histories of suffering. The lab gives clarity, but it also simplifies. This is one reason the field sometimes seemed to produce two different kinds of truth at once. In carefully controlled experiments, meditation could reveal elegant mechanisms. In clinical reality, effects were often more modest, variable, and entangled with many other factors. The question of specificity returned again and again. Was mindfulness genuinely doing something unique? Or was it one member of a broader family of self-regulation techniques that share overlapping mechanisms? This mattered more than it may appear. If meditation has a distinctive value, then researchers need to know what distinguishes it from relaxation training, cognitive therapy, breathing exercises, supportive group programs, or placebo-rich interventions that make people feel cared for and hopeful. If, on the other hand, its benefits arise from a mix of common therapeutic factors and some contemplative elements, then exaggerated claims about uniqueness may be misleading. The scientific maturity of the field depended on being willing to ask that question even when the answer might be less flattering than advocates hoped. Part of the difficulty lay in the word meditation itself. It sounds singular, but it refers to a family of practices with different aims, instructions, intensities, and psychological profiles. Focused attention on the breath is not identical to open monitoring of all arising experience. Loving kindness or compassion practice is not the same as body scanning. Mantra repetition, or non-dual awareness practices aimed at loosening subject-object structure. Some methods emphasize stability, others receptivity. Some train attentional selection, others a different relation to thought and feeling. Some are practiced in silence, others in movement, ritual, or devotional context. To ask whether meditation changes the brain is therefore a little like asking whether exercise changes the body. The answer is probably yes, but the meaning of the answer depends almost entirely on what kind of exercise, done how often, by whom, and toward what end. The same problem applied to experience levels. A monk with decades of intensive training is not simply a more advanced version of an office worker taking an 8-week mindfulness course after stressful years of ordinary life. Their practices may overlap, but the scale, context, and goals differ enormously. Yet public conversation often blurred them into a single continuum. A study on long-term Tibetan practitioners might be read as evidence for the benefits of short secular courses. A trial of beginners in a hospital setting might be taken as support for ancient contemplative claims about deep transformation. The imagination leaped between levels much faster than the science allowed. Meanwhile, there was another subtle shift taking place. As researchers tried to define what meditation changed, they were also changing what counted as a meaningful outcome. Earlier physiological work had been satisfied to identify lower oxygen consumption or slower respiration. Clinical programs focused on stress, pain, and vulnerability to relapse. Neuroscience then pushed toward networks, oscillations, and structural correlates. But beneath all of these, a more philosophical issue remained unresolved. Are we most interested in what meditation changes in the organism, or in what it changes in the person's relation to experience? Those are not identical. A measurable bodily shift is valuable, but it may still leave untouched the central contemplative claim that freedom depends on seeing thoughts, sensations, and feelings differently. This is where the science became unexpectedly rich. The more carefully researchers looked, the harder it was to reduce meditation to one single mechanism. In some contexts, it looked like attentional training. In others, it resembled exposure, a repeated willingness to remain with difficult sensations without immediate escape. In other cases, it carried aspects of emotion regulation, meta-awareness, decentering, self-distancing, or reduced identification with passing mental events. Different traditions had described such shifts in their own vocabularies for centuries. Modern psychology, with its preference for operational clarity, kept breaking them apart into partially overlapping constructs. That breaking apart was necessary. It also risked losing the integrated character of lived practice. You can hear the tension in the language researchers eventually adopted. Terms like decentering, reperceiving, non-reactivity, and meta-awareness all point towards subtle changes in the stance from which experience is encountered. They are attempts to capture a transformation that is neither purely cognitive nor purely physiological. A painful thought may still arise, but it is no longer treated as identical with the self. A sensation may remain unpleasant, but it no longer commands the same chain of aversion and resistance. Attention may drift, but there is earlier recognition of the drift and gentler return. These are fine-grained shifts, difficult to dramatize and even harder to measure. Yet they may be closer to the heart of what meditation actually trains than the broad public claim that it changes the brain. And that, perhaps, was the quiet turning point hidden inside this phase of the research. The field had entered with a grand question and was being forced towards smaller, more disciplined ones. Instead of asking whether meditation works in some sweeping sense, scientists increasingly had to ask which practice influences, which process, under which conditions. Instead of assuming one central mechanism, they had to consider layered pathways. Instead of treating neural findings as self-explanatory, they had to reconnect them with attention, pain, emotion, and the unstable language of first-person experience. The phenomenon was not disappearing under scrutiny. It was becoming more intricate. That intricacy did not weaken the story. It changed its tone. Meditation no longer looked like a simple cure, a single mental lever that, once pulled, would make the mind calmer and the brain healthier in a uniform way. It looked more like a cluster of trainable skills and altered relationships. Some subtle, some measurable, some perhaps more durable than others. A person might become less captive to rumination without becoming serene. Pain might become less overwhelming without becoming mild. Attention might strengthen in certain contexts while emotional wounds remained complicated. The science, slowly and almost against its own hunger for clean answers, was learning to speak in this more patient register. And as soon as that patience began to develop, another consequence followed. A field that had been intoxicated, at least in public, by elegant scans and bold claims, now had to face the gap between a compelling narrative and a more uneven body of evidence. The closer researchers came to asking precise questions, the more visible the methodological cracks became, and the easier it was to see how much hype had rushed in ahead of certainty. The more carefully the field tried to define its claims, the harder it became to ignore how quickly those claims had spread ahead of the evidence. Meditation research had entered a difficult but familiar stage in the life of modern science. A promising subject had produced striking early results. The public had embraced a cleaner and more exciting version of the story than the data fully justified. And researchers now faced the less glamorous task of asking whether the foundations were as solid as they had begun to appear. That moment is rarely pleasant. It can feel from inside a field, almost like betrayal. Yet, it is also one of the clearest signs that a discipline is growing up. Part of the difficulty came from success itself. By the 2000s and 2010s, mindfulness and meditation research had grown at remarkable speed. The number of published papers rose sharply. Clinical programs spread through hospitals, schools, corporations, and therapy settings. Brain imaging studies circulated widely, and the popular press learned how to tell the story in a way audiences found irresistible. 8 weeks of training could rewire your brain. Ancient contemplative wisdom had now been confirmed by modern science. A practice once associated with monasteries and retreat centers became part of wellness culture, workplace stress management, and public education. To many people, the case seemed almost settled. before the most careful questions had even been asked. Science, however, tends to become more demanding precisely when a story grows too smooth. Once the field expanded, researchers were no longer comparing a handful of intriguing findings. They were confronting a crowded literature filled with different traditions, different populations, different definitions of meditation, different outcome measures, and different standards of methodological rigor. What looked from a distance like one coherent area of evidence often turned out, on closer inspection, to be a patchwork. Some studies involved experienced practitioners. Others used brief training in novices. Some measured mood, some attention, some pain, some structural brain differences, some self-reported mindfulness, some physiological states during practice. The shared label suggested a single body of knowledge. The actual literature suggested something looser and more unstable. One of the earliest and most persistent concerns involved control groups. In medicine and psychology, a result matters most when it survives comparison against a meaningful alternative. If a person improves after a mindfulness course, that is interesting. But compared with what? Compared with doing nothing? Compared with resting? Compared with an education group? A support group? A relaxation program? Cognitive therapy? Physical exercise? Placebo expectation? Or simply the relief of taking time each week for oneself? These distinctions are not technical footnotes. They shape the entire interpretation of the evidence. A weak control group can make an intervention look more special than it really is. Mindfulness research often struggled here because the intervention itself contains many potentially active ingredients. A group program offers social support, structure, instructor guidance, expectation of benefit, and repeated contact with one's own distress under relatively safe conditions. It may also include body awareness, breath attention, gentle movement, and cognitive reframing, even if not under that exact name. When participants feel better afterward, isolating the specific contribution of mindfulness becomes remarkably difficult. Researchers could say that the program helped, and often it did. Saying exactly why it helped, or which component was indispensable, proved far more challenging. Another trouble spot lay in measurement itself. Self-report has always been central to this field, which makes sense because meditation concerns experience. People are asked whether they feel less stressed, less depressed, more mindful, more aware, less reactive, more accepting. Yet the very language of mindfulness can shape the way participants understand and describe themselves. Someone who has just completed a course may genuinely believe they are more present, more attentive, or less judgmental, especially if they have been trained to notice those qualities and value them. That does not mean they are fabricating results. It means self-report, in this context, is entangled with expectation, vocabulary, identity, and aspiration. A measure may capture change, but it may also capture the adoption of a new way of talking about inner life. Even constructs that sound precise can become slippery under scrutiny. Take mindfulness itself. In some studies, it refers to a trait measured by questionnaires. In others, it refers to the practice of paying attention in a certain way. Elsewhere, it refers to a therapeutic package, a style of awareness, a cluster of attitudes, or a skill that can supposedly be strengthened. Researchers were sometimes asking whether mindfulness training increases mindfulness, then assessing that increase with questionnaires shaped by the same conceptual world that the training had already introduced. This circularity did not invalidate the whole enterprise, but it raised a serious concern. Was the field measuring a distinct phenomenon, or teaching people to describe themselves in the language the field preferred. These pressures accumulated gradually until they became too visible to ignore. By the late 2000s and 10s, some of the most pointed criticism came from researchers who were not dismissing meditation as nonsense and were not hostile to contemplative practice as such. Their concern was methodological and intellectual. A field that had grown rapidly, attracted generous public enthusiasm, and produced striking headlines was in danger of overstating what it actually knew. In 2018, Nicholas Van Dam and colleagues published a major critique in Perspectives on Psychological Science, remembered by many through its subtitle-like warning, "Mind the hype." The paper did not argue that meditation research should be abandoned. It argued that the field's public image had become more confident than its evidentiary base warranted. The force of that critique came from its breadth. It pointed to definitional confusion, weak study designs, small samples, inadequate controls, publication bias, exaggerated interpretations of brain data, and a tendency for enthusiastic advocacy to run ahead of careful evidence. It also noted something more culturally awkward. Meditation had become morally attractive. It was associated with compassion, awareness, mental health, and a kind of secular wisdom. Once a field acquires that aura, criticism can feel almost impolite, as though methodological caution were somehow spiritually narrow. Yet science cannot afford to protect favored subjects from scrutiny simply because they align with admirable human aspirations. There is a certain irony here. Meditation was often praised as a practice that weakens attachment, softens certainty, and teaches one to observe mental habits with honesty. The science around meditation sometimes needed exactly the same discipline. Researchers had to become less attached to the most flattering interpretation of their findings. They had to notice how cultural desire shapes scientific narrative. They had to sit with ambiguity rather than rushing toward the most marketable conclusion. In that sense, the backlash against hype was not separate from the deeper spirit of careful inquiry. It was one of the moments when the field began, however unevenly, to apply a more contemplative patience to itself. The critique of neuroimaging was especially important. Brain scans had given meditation research much of its glamour. But glamour is not the same as clarity. Structural MRI findings, for example, were often discussed as evidence that meditation changes cortical thickness or gray matter density. Some of those studies were intriguing and methodologically serious within the limits of their time. Still, many were cross-sectional, meaning they compared meditators and non-meditators at one point in time. That design cannot easily determine whether meditation caused the difference or whether people with certain characteristics were more likely to become long-term practitioners in the first place. The public story often treated these differences as proof of transformation. The science was frequently more tentative. Longitudinal studies, which follow participants over time and compare them against strong control groups, offer a more reliable path. Yet those studies are harder, slower, and often less dramatic in their results. A person who has practiced intensively for 20 years may differ from a novice in many ways that a short intervention cannot reproduce. Meanwhile, a brief 8-week course may still be meaningful without producing large structural changes visible on MRI. These realities pull against one another. The public wants a clean message. Researchers increasingly found themselves forced to say something less satisfying. Some changes may be state-dependent, some subtle, some clinically helpful, some hard to detect, and some perhaps not as robust as early excitement suggested. This tension became sharper when larger and more carefully controlled work began yielding more modest outcomes. A field that has spent years celebrating dramatic possibilities does not always greet null or mixed findings with enthusiasm. But null findings are not failures in the deeper scientific sense. They are part of how a subject finds its true dimensions. When later studies failed to confirm some stronger claims about structural brain change, they did not prove that meditation does nothing. They did something more useful. They narrowed the range of what could honestly be said. They reminded researchers that impressive hypotheses deserve the inconvenience of serious testing. Publication bias added another layer to the story. Positive findings travel more easily than negative or inconclusive ones. Journals, readers, institutions, and journalists all have reasons, often understandable ones, to notice exciting results more than quiet corrections. A paper suggesting unusual gamma synchrony, reduced pain, altered network activity, or structural brain differences is easier to write about than a careful study showing no clear advantage over an active control. Over time, this can distort the perceived balance of evidence, even when individual scientists are working in good faith. The literature begins to lean toward excitement, and public understanding leans even further. By the time the field tries to self-correct, a simplified myth may already be far ahead. Then there is the matter of dosage and heterogeneity. Meditation research often pooled together people whose actual exposure to practice differed enormously. Some participants attended weekly classes and practiced at home for modest periods. Others had years or decades of intensive contemplative training. Some interventions emphasized body scanning and non-judgmental awareness. Others emphasized compassion, concentration, or a broader therapeutic package. Some participants entered studies with clinical depression, chronic pain, or anxiety disorders. Others were healthy volunteers or college students. Such variation is unavoidable to some degree, but it complicates every grand claim. A field can sound unified in public while remaining internally diffuse in fact. The challenge was not merely statistical. It touched the social life of the science itself. Mindfulness had become institutionalized in ways that created subtle pressures toward optimism. Researchers could be practitioners. Instructors could be investigators. Universities could support centers devoted to contemplative science. Healthcare systems could invest in mindfulness-based services. Corporate wellness culture could adopt the language. None of this necessarily corrupts the science, but it does make reflexive caution more important. When a field is connected to therapeutic hope, institutional prestige, and moral aspiration, skepticism has to work harder to make itself heard. Some critics pushed further, arguing that the entire enterprise risked turning into a kind of confirmation ritual for values the culture already wanted to endorse. In this view, meditation research sometimes appeared less interested in discovering whether mindfulness helps than in discovering how to describe its benefits in a language modern institutions would respect. That criticism can be overstated, and it would be unfair to apply it to every researcher in the field. Yet it points toward a real danger. When the answer is socially desirable, negative findings can begin to feel like interruptions rather than information. Science then stops behaving like inquiry and starts behaving like public relations. The most responsible response did not come in the form of total rejection. Few serious scholars argued that all meditation findings were meaningless or that contemplative practices had no value. The corrective movement was subtler and, in some ways, more demanding. It asked for better controls, larger samples, pre-registration, clearer definitions, stronger separation between state and trait claims, and more modest public language. It encouraged researchers to distinguish clinical usefulness from mechanistic certainty. It asked whether improvements were specific to mindfulness or comparable to other well-constructed interventions. In other words, it tried to pull the field back from vague admiration toward disciplined comparison. This had an unexpected effect on the intellectual tone of the subject. Early enthusiasm had often cast meditation as a nearly ideal meeting point between ancient wisdom and modern science. A rare case where both seemed to validate one another beautifully. The methodological critiques disrupted that elegance. They did not destroy the subject. They made it less mythic. Meditation could still be helpful, still scientifically interesting, still historically rich. But it was no longer so easy to narrate the field as a triumphant march from contemplative tradition to neural confirmation. Instead, the history began to look more like the history of many ambitious sciences. Initial findings open a door. Public enthusiasm races through it. Then the slower work begins, sifting signal from overinterpretation. A mature listener might hear something almost reassuring in that turn. If the field had remained all promise and no self-critique, it would deserve less trust, not more. The fact that meditation researchers began challenging one another, questioning methods, and revising claims suggests that the science was not frozen inside advocacy alone. It was still capable of correction. Still, the correction came with a cost. Once the halo of certainty weakens, other neglected questions start to surface. If the benefits were sometimes overstated, what else had been missed? If the public had learned to see meditation as universally benign, what experiences had been left out of the story? Those questions did not arrive from nowhere. They had always been waiting at the margins, quieter than the headlines, less marketable than the glowing promise of brain change and inner calm. As the field learned to doubt its own hype, it became easier to notice something it had too often treated as an afterthought. Silence, attention, and inwardness do not always bring relief. Sometimes they uncover difficulty, disorientation, or forms of suffering that a culture of wellness is poorly prepared to name. By the time meditation research had begun to correct its own excesses, another absence in the story was becoming difficult to ignore. For years, public discussion had treated meditation as though it belonged to a category of practices so gentle, so natural, and so obviously beneficial that serious concern about harm felt almost out of place. Drugs had side effects. Surgery carried risks. Even psychotherapy could unsettle people before it helped them. Meditation, by contrast, was often presented as breathing, noticing, softening, and gradually becoming more at ease inside one's own mind. It was precisely that reassuring image that made the missing part of the story so hard to see. Yet silence is never truly empty, especially for a mind already carrying strain, grief, fear, or old unresolved pain. To become still is not always to become calm. Sometimes stillness functions more like an amplifier, allowing what had been blurred by busyness to step forward into awareness. A person who sits quietly may discover not peace, but agitation. Someone who turns inward after years of avoidance may meet intrusive memory, dread, old shame, or a frightening sense of internal instability. Long before modern mindfulness entered clinics and corporate wellness programs, contemplative traditions understood that inward practice could open difficult terrain as well as healing insight. That older knowledge did not always survive the transition into secular culture. As meditation was translated into a language of stress reduction and emotional well-being, it often became easier to teach but harder to describe, honestly. The emphasis fell on accessibility, safety, and broad usefulness. In many ways, that shift was understandable. A hospital program or workplace intervention cannot be introduced with the full gravity of a monastic path. Still, something important was flattened in the process. Practices that had once been embedded in systems of guidance, discipline, ethics, and careful interpretation were increasingly framed as universally soothing tools for modern life. A distinction is needed here, because not every difficult experience in meditation should be treated as evidence of harm. Many serious forms of training involve discomfort. Physical exercise can exhaust and strain before it strengthens. Psychotherapy may stir painful material before it helps reorganize a person's life. In the same way, meditation can bring boredom, restlessness, irritability, sadness, or emotional rawness into sharper focus without that meaning something has gone wrong. A person may simply be becoming aware of what was already there. The deeper difficulty begins when the culture around the practice no longer has the language to tell the difference between temporary challenge, meaningful confrontation, and genuine destabilization. Modern research was slow to reckon with that difference. Clinical studies of mindfulness-based interventions often concentrated on benefits while giving far less attention to adverse effects or troubling responses. That imbalance is not unique to this field, but here it carried a special irony. A practice associated with awareness was being studied in ways that were sometimes oddly inattentive to its own negative cases. Participants who felt worse became disoriented, or encountered troubling inner experiences did not always appear clearly in the literature. When harm is not carefully tracked, the resulting silence can be mistaken for proof of safety. Part of the issue lies in the nature of meditation-related distress itself. It does not always resemble the clean categories that medicine prefers. An adverse drug reaction can be more straightforward to identify. Meditation-related difficulty may arrive gradually, wear different names in different contexts, and resist easy interpretation. One person may report panic, derealization, or intensified trauma symptoms. Another may feel a disturbing loosening of identity, perceptual distortion, or a sense that ordinary reality has become unstable. In a retreat setting, some of these experiences may be interpreted through contemplative maps. In a therapeutic setting, they may sound like clinical warning signs. In the growing world of mass-market mindfulness, they may have no clear name at all. This is where the work of researchers such as Willoughby Britton and Jared Lindahl became especially important. Their contribution was not to invent the idea that meditation can be difficult. Traditional contemplative systems had long recognized forms of that truth. What they did was force modern meditation culture, clinical mindfulness, and contemplative science to confront the issue systematically and in contemporary language. Through interviews, qualitative analysis, and later measurement efforts, they helped document a wide range of challenging experiences that had often been minimized, romanticized, or left outside the official story. What emerged from that work was not a single danger, but a landscape of varied responses. Some practitioners described anxiety, fear, panic, or emotional volatility. Others reported insomnia, cognitive disorganization, perceptual changes, intensified traumatic memory, or a troubling loss of ordinary self-coherence. For some, the difficulty passed. For others, it lingered and interfered with daily functioning. Some episodes unfolded during intensive retreat practice, where people were meditating for many hours a day. Others appeared in less extreme forms during ordinary secular practice. The common lesson was simple and uncomfortable at the same time. Meditation could no longer be honestly described as though its effects were uniformly gentle. From a psychological perspective, this should never have been entirely surprising. Meditation often asks a person to remain with experience rather than reflexively escaping from it. That can be deeply therapeutic. But it can also remove layers of habitual defense. Much of everyday life is organized around distraction, movement, rumination, entertainment, planning, comparison, and the endless small strategies by which people avoid direct contact with certain kinds of suffering. A contemplative practice can interrupt those strategies. When it does, long muted material may surface with an intensity the practitioner did not expect. For some, that is the beginning of healing. For others, especially without proper support, it may feel like being flooded. Different people also bring very different vulnerabilities to the same instructions. A short grounding exercise may be helpful for one person and destabilizing for another. Someone carrying unresolved trauma, dissociative tendencies, severe anxiety, or a history of psychotic vulnerability may not experience inward attention the way a relatively stable and mildly stressed participant does. Even within the category of meditation, practices differ dramatically. Some emphasize sensory grounding and gentle presence. Others push more deeply into concentration, self-inquiry, emptiness, or disidentification from thought and identity. To tell the public that meditation helps without clarifying such differences is a little like saying that exercise heals the body without distinguishing between walking, marathon training, fasting, or extreme endurance practice. Another complication is that difficult meditative experiences can be interpreted through several frameworks at once. A clinician may see dissociation. A meditation teacher may recognize a stage of practice. A practitioner may feel both frightened and convinced that something spiritually significant is occurring. A neuroscientist might speak of altered arousal, disrupted self-processing, or attention destabilization. None of these readings is automatically wrong, but they do not always lead to the same response. A traditional contemplative setting may offer maps, rituals, and teacher guidance that help contain the experience. A secular mindfulness course may offer far less interpretive support. A commercial app, of course, offers almost none. That thinning of context matters. Many older contemplative traditions developed within highly structured worlds for a reason. Practice was rarely imagined as a casual consumer activity. It was guided, paced, interpreted, and often morally framed. Modern secular adaptations retained some of the methods while removing much of the surrounding container. In clinical settings, that made meditation more accessible and more portable. In wellness culture, it also made it easier to market. But accessibility has a price when powerful inward practices are presented as if they were interchangeable with ordinary relaxation, without context, preparation, and careful distinction. A person may enter practice expecting calm and encounter destabilization with no vocabulary for what is happening. The reluctance to speak openly about this has its own cultural roots. Meditation has become a symbol for so many things contemporary society admires: presence, emotional intelligence, compassion, depth, wisdom, freedom from distraction, resistance to frantic modern life. Once a practice acquires that symbolic status, criticism can feel almost morally awkward. To mention adverse effects may sound, to some, like attacking something pure. Yet mature science cannot afford to protect favored subjects from scrutiny. A practice does not become less meaningful because it has limits or risks. On the contrary, failing to name those limits is one of the fastest ways to turn something valuable into an ideology. Population research has begun to reinforce that need for realism. Estimates vary, definitions vary, and severity varies. But a non-trivial minority of meditators report experiences they regard as adverse, distressing, or disruptive. That sentence should be spoken carefully. Adverse can refer to anything from temporary difficulty to prolonged impairment. Retreat populations are different from general app users. Clinical patients differ from healthy volunteers. The point is not to imply a hidden epidemic. It is to make clear that meditation belongs inside the ordinary ethical world of interventions, where benefits and risks both require honest attention. Once that is admitted, the conversation becomes more useful. The question is no longer whether meditation is good or bad in some absolute sense. The question becomes one of fit, dosage, context, readiness, and guidance. A brief body-based mindfulness exercise taught by a skilled clinician may be appropriate and stabilizing for many people. Intensive silent retreat or self-directed deep practice may call for screening, preparation, and more experienced support. Certain individuals may need trauma-sensitive adaptations. Others may need to postpone or avoid forms of practice that turn attention inward too sharply. Such nuance does not weaken the field. It makes the field more serious. Scientific study still faces obvious challenges here. Meditation-related difficulties are not always easy to classify. Some arise slowly. Some may be interpreted positively, even while causing disruption. Some may reveal a pre-existing vulnerability rather than being caused solely by practice. Others may begin as meaningful challenge and then slide into something more destabilizing. Yet none of that complexity justifies silence. If anything, it makes careful reporting more important. A science of meditation that only records uplift has already stopped studying the whole phenomenon. There is another reason this darker chapter matters. It changes how we understand the practice itself. Meditation is not working on a blank mental surface. It is working on consciousness as it is actually lived, with its old injuries, its defensive habits, its longings, its compulsions, and its fragile constructions of self. Any serious intervention into that territory can produce varied consequences. The earlier public image of mindfulness as universally gentle now looks less like compassion and more like simplification. Honest care requires a more differentiated understanding of what these practices can do, for whom, and under what conditions. Still, it would be just as misleading to swing toward the opposite myth and treat meditation as secretly dangerous by nature. That would merely replace one distortion with another. The emerging picture is quieter and more difficult than either extreme. Meditation can help, sometimes profoundly. It can also unsettle, expose, and destabilize. It can clarify suffering and, in some people or contexts, temporarily intensify it. Those truths do not cancel one another. They belong to the same reality. A practice powerful enough to alter a person's relationship to mind and experience was never likely to be simple. By now, the central question of this documentary has changed in character. Early on, it may have sounded like a matter of proof, whether meditation really changes the brain. At this stage, the harder task is description. Change seems plausible, even well supported in some domains. The deeper problem is how to describe that change without turning it into hype, moral advertising, or therapeutic mythology. Brain activity, attention, pain, emotional regulation, clinical benefit, methodological caution, and difficult meditation-related experiences all have to remain in the frame at once. From here, the final movement of the story is not about choosing between wonder and doubt. It is about asking what can still be said with confidence after the excitement has cooled, after the methods have been questioned, and after the field has begun to face both the promise and the cost of turning inward. The question sounds different now. At the beginning, it could be carried easily by headlines, conference stages, wellness books, and confident summaries aimed at the public. Does meditation change the brain? Yes, it seemed. And perhaps in ways more dramatic than anyone had imagined. But the longer one remains with the evidence, the less willing the question is to stay in that simple form. It begins to break apart into smaller and more demanding versions of itself. What kind of meditation? What kind of brain measure? During practice or outside it? After weeks of training or after years of discipline? In beginners, patients, long-term practitioners, or monastics? The story has not lost force. It has simply become more exacting. A careful answer now has to begin with a distinction that the public conversation often ignored. There is a meaningful difference between saying meditation can alter brain activity and saying it can produce large, stable structural changes in the brain. The first claim is, at this point, relatively unsurprising. A practice that trains attention, changes breathing, alters emotional stance, or shifts the relation to pain would be expected to modulate brain activity in some way. Minds do not float above biology. If experience changes, neural dynamics are likely changing with it. The second claim, however, asks for something more durable and more specific. It asks whether repeated practice leaves a robust and detectable trace in the architecture of the brain itself, and whether that trace can be confidently attributed to meditation rather than to background differences between the people who choose to meditate and those who do not. That difference matters because much of the enchantment around meditation research gathered around the stronger version. Brain activity changing during meditation is scientifically important, but it is not especially mysterious. Brains change their activity with every task. Mood, decision, memory, and shift of attention. What captured the imagination was the possibility of deeper remaking. The idea that sitting quietly, day after day, might physically reshape the machinery of mind in lasting ways. Some studies seem to point in that direction. Others, especially more rigorous and better controlled work, called for greater caution. A mature reading of the literature no longer allows those two levels of claim to slide into one another without resistance. Even this more careful formulation still does not settle what many viewers may really be asking. Most people do not, in ordinary life, care about cortical thickness in the abstract. They care about suffering, concentration, rumination, fear, exhaustion, and whether a practice might change the texture of being alive inside one's own mind. In that sense, one of the quiet lessons of this field is that the brain question was never enough by itself. Neural findings became culturally powerful because they seemed to validate changes people could feel: more stable attention, different relations to pain, less automatic capture by thought, moments of inner spaciousness, a changed ability to stay with experience without immediately recoiling from it. The science did not create those experiences. It tried to describe their correlates and mechanisms, sometimes elegantly, sometimes clumsily, and sometimes with more confidence than the evidence deserved. Meta-analysis and large reviews have gradually pulled the subject toward a more measured center. Meditation and mindfulness-based interventions do appear capable of helping with certain forms of distress, especially anxiety, depressive vulnerability, stress-related burden, and pain in some contexts, Yet the effects are often small to moderate rather than miraculous. They are meaningful, especially at the scale of lived experience. But they do not justify the grander mythology that formed around the field. Meditation is not a universal cure, not a single mechanism, and not a guaranteed path to serenity. For some people, it may become a durable support. For others, it may offer modest benefit. For some, it may be difficult, poorly matched, or actively destabilizing. Scientific honesty requires leaving that unevenness intact. This, perhaps, is the most important correction the field has undergone. The question is no longer whether meditation works in some vague and triumphant sense. It is closer to asking where, how, for whom, and under which conditions it tends to help. That shift from absolute judgment to conditional understanding can feel less satisfying at first. It lacks the emotional force of a breakthrough headline, yet it reflects a deeper kind of respect for both science and practice. Human beings differ, practices differ, contexts differ. Clinical settings differ from retreat settings. Focused attention differs from compassion training. Open monitoring, mantra practice, body scanning, and the more demanding contemplative forms that unsettle ordinary constructions of self. To preserve those differences is not to weaken the subject. It is to begin seeing it clearly. The brain, then, returns in a quieter role. Rather than serving as the final courtroom where meditation is either vindicated or dismissed, it becomes one layer in a larger account. Neural data can show changes in activity during practice, differences between long-term practitioners and controls, altered processing of pain, shifts in network dynamics, and perhaps, under some circumstances, structural changes whose meaning remains under active debate. But none of those findings stands alone. They gain meaning only when placed alongside self-report, behavioral measures, clinical outcomes, historical context, and the internal phenomenology of practice itself. A scanner can show patterns. It cannot tell us, on its own, whether a person has become less dominated by fear, more patient with pain, more capable of attention, or more vulnerable to disorientation. The brain is indispensable here. It is also not the whole story. There is something almost fitting in that limitation. Meditation entered modern science partly because it seemed to sit at the threshold between first-person and third-person knowledge. One person sits quietly and notices thought, sensation, impulse, memory, aversion, and the elusive sense of self. Another person arrives with instruments, questionnaire, tasks, control groups, imaging methods, and theories of cognition. The dream of contemplative science, at its best, was not merely to reduce one side to the other. It was to let these two forms of inquiry meet without either pretending to be complete by itself. That dream has not failed, but neither has it fully succeeded. The field still wrestles with the difficulty of studying inner experience without flattening it into proxies, and of respecting subjective reports without surrendering standards of evidence. Seen historically, that struggle may be one of the most valuable outcomes of the entire enterprise. Meditation research did not simply reveal facts about monks, mindfulness courses, or gamma oscillations. It exposed the limits of some very modern habits of thought. It showed how quickly people turn neural images into authority. It showed how readily therapeutic culture embraces morally attractive practices and then oversimplifies them. It showed how science can be tempted by beautiful findings, and how necessary self-correction becomes once a field begins to believe its own public story. At the same time, It also showed that interior life is not beyond systematic curiosity, suffering, attention, self-reference, and the felt shape of consciousness can enter serious inquiry, even if never in a perfectly stable form. Another question shadows the scientific one, and perhaps deserves equal weight by the end. What exactly has modern culture done to meditation? In being translated into medicine, therapy, productivity tools, and wellness platforms, the practice became broadly accessible in ways that likely helped many people. Yet that accessibility came through selection. Certain elements were highlighted, others muted. Stress reduction became easier to market than moral transformation. Attention training was easier to standardize than liberation from attachment. Compassion could be welcomed, but metaphysical or soteriological language was usually thinned away. Later still, digital culture and app economies made meditation portable, on-demand, subscription-based, and increasingly woven into the rhythms of self-management. The practice did not merely enter modernity, it was remade by it. That remaking is neither wholly corrupt nor wholly innocent. A hospital-based mindfulness class for chronic pain patients is not the same as a monastic path, but it need not pretend to be. An app that helps an anxious person establish 5 minutes of daily attention may be limited, yet still genuinely useful. Trouble begins only when adaptation is mistaken for the whole. Then meditation becomes a vague symbol of mental hygiene, a branded technology of calm, severed from the larger traditions that once treated inner work as ethically and existentially demanding. Modern science, in some cases, unintentionally reinforced that narrowing by validating the parts most legible to institutions while leaving the harder, stranger, or more disorienting dimensions in the shadows. That may be why the most trustworthy answer at the end of this documentary has to include both affirmation and restraint. Yes, meditation appears capable of changing the brain in the broad sense that any disciplined mental training changes the living dynamics of a brain. Yes, some evidence suggests effects on attention, pain processing, emotional regulation, and self-referential activity. While some structural findings remain intriguing but less settled than popular accounts often imply, yes, mindfulness-based programs can help some people in meaningful ways. Yet none of these statements licenses a simple equation between meditation and neural upgrade, or between contemplative practice and guaranteed well-being. The true picture is more textured than that, and more human. One reason the human dimension matters so much is that meditation is practiced by persons, not brains in isolation. A person comes to the cushion with history, temperament, longing, injury, expectation, social world, culture, and body. They may seek relief, truth, discipline, belonging, performance, or survival. They may be exhausted, lonely, traumatized, curious, spiritually hungry, skeptical, or simply desperate for a little less friction inside their own mind. Whatever the scanner eventually records, practice unfolds in that richer terrain. Two people may perform the same exercise and emerge with very different consequences. Science can and should search for general patterns. But the general pattern never fully replaces the singular life in which meditation is actually lived. For that reason, perhaps the best final answer is not a verdict, but a set of proportions. The early enthusiasts were right that meditation deserved scientific attention. The skeptics were right that enthusiasm alone could not substitute for method. The clinicians were right that these practices can help relieve certain forms of suffering. The critics were right that they were too often marketed as universally safe and universally beneficial. The neuroscientists were right to ask what training attention does in the brain. The contemplative traditions were right to insist that interior life cannot be exhausted by measurement alone. None of these positions contains the whole truth. Together, they form something closer to it. There is a strange humility in where the story finally lands. Meditation did not turn out to be a magical exception to the ordinary rules of evidence, but neither did it collapse into mere hype. It proved substantial enough to survive criticism, yet ambiguous enough to resist triumphal summary. It helped reveal that subjective practice and biological process are inseparable without being identical. It reminded science that some of the most consequential features of mind are difficult to operationalize cleanly. It reminded culture that morally attractive practices are especially vulnerable to oversimplification. And it reminded anyone who has ever sat still long enough to feel the crowding of thoughts that the most familiar territory may also be the least understood. Late at night, when the documentary has nearly come to rest, the original question still remains, but it no longer sounds like a challenge thrown across a debate stage. It sounds more like a measure of how carefully one has learned to listen. Does meditation really change the brain? Yes. In some ways that seem increasingly credible, and perhaps in ways whose full meaning is still being worked out. But the deeper truth is that meditation also changed the questions science was willing to ask. It drew physiology, psychology, psychiatry, neuroscience, contemplative history, and first-person inquiry into the same room. It exposed modern hunger for certainty, for images, for healing, for self-improvement, and for something that might hold together the broken attention of contemporary life. And maybe that is where the most enduring significance lies. The field did not simply test an ancient practice. It revealed how difficult it is to study consciousness without simplifying it, how tempting it is to sell a method before fully understanding it, and how much patience is required to keep knowledge from hardening into mythology. Meditation may change the brain. It may change attention, pain, and the felt relation between thought and self. It may help some people suffer less, yet beyond all of that, it has also served as a mirror, reflecting back to modern science its strengths, its blind spots, and its unfinished effort to understand the mind from both within and without. From here, only a quieter reflection remains, not to close the question too neatly, but to sit beside what has been learned, and what still refuses to be made simple. By the end of this story, the question turns out to be both simpler and more complicated than it first appeared. Meditation does seem capable of changing something real in human experience. It can alter attention, influence the way pain is processed, affect emotional reactivity, and in some settings, shift patterns of brain activity. Yet the deeper truth is that science has had a much harder time determining exactly how large those changes are, how lasting they may be, and what kind of practice produces which kind of effect. The quiet certainty promised by popular culture gives way, in the end, to a more honest and more interesting picture. That picture changes the way we think about the mind itself. For a long time, inner life seemed too private, too fluid, too subjective to be studied with confidence. Meditation research did not solve that problem once and for all, but it forced science to take it more seriously. It showed that the border between subjective experience and objective measurement is not fixed. It can be In that sense, the science of meditation is not only about monks, patience, scanners, or stress reduction. It is about whether human awareness, in all its fragility and difficulty, can ever be understood without losing what makes it human in the first place. And perhaps that is why the subject continues to hold such power. Scientific curiosity does not move only towards stars, particles, fossils, and distant ages. Sometimes it turns inward, toward breath, thought, suffering, and the restless movement of the mind. Even there, or perhaps especially there, the search remains unfinished. We learn something, then discover how much remains uncertain. We name a pattern, then realize the pattern is not the whole, and so the inquiry continues, patient and incomplete, asking whether the deepest changes in human life can ever be fully captured, or whether part of truth will always remain just beyond the reach of our instruments.